It's a joy to have so many people in here. Hi. Yesterday we had a bit of a speaker pre-dinner. I arrived slightly late because my flight was delayed, which happens when you come from Berlin. Then I sit down and there's this really eloquent, nice British gentleman sitting next to me, and I ask him, so what are you going to talk about tomorrow? It was a speaker dinner. And he says, well, I have this startup, I teach machines how to smell. I'm like, good. I might have to rewrite my talk a little bit. I don't know how many of you were in that other session that was a few hours ago. Good. So I kind of make sure that you're not going to be bored while the rest of you sort of has a similar kind of setting to make sense of what I'm going to talk about. What I would like to do now is I don't want to sell you anything. I don't want to tell you how great machine olfaction is, as we call it in the sort of the medical world. We always have to have very expensive words for something that you could just call smelling. But I want to share some lessons learned, humbly, lessons that I wish sort of I had thought about a bit earlier. I've been in this journey myself for 3 years. Lessons that I've seen other people needing. And I hope it's relevant for you. We'll touch a little bit on the world of medicine. I'm a doctor myself. We touch a little bit on the world of hardware, not too much, but my intention is to provide you with something that I hope will make a difference in some of the things that you do. If you would like to focus on something, we will have some time to do a Q&A. If you want to jump in while I talk, I don't mind. Feel free to just shoot your questions if you have them. Very briefly about myself, just so that you kind of know which perspectives I'm looking at these things from. I'm a founder myself. I've been in sort of the digital health space for, I don't know, 8 years or something like that. Before that, I was in the hospital resuscitating people. Then for the last 3 years, I've been on a hardware medtech founder journey. I now know why it's called hardware. It's simply because it's so hard to found things in that space for a variety of reasons. Happy to talk about that too, if somebody feels inclined to go into that field. I am also an angel investor. I advise a VC fund called Speed Invest, which is very active around the world by now. And I'm on the board of a couple of other startups. I help established companies, which is part of my current founder journey also. I help them build out a digital strategy. So I worked with Roche, with Siemens Healthineers, with Audi, the car maker. They also have a digital health strategy, and many others of the big brands. And so I keep seeing similar patterns in here. Right now, I'm the founder of a company that helps hardware native companies with sort of sensor technologies to make the leap into the AI world, especially in the regulated spaces where often they're not even in the cloud yet. So because of the whole regulatory burden and so on, legacy systems, it's hard for them so that they can deploy AI, etc. And then I also do some M&A work. So that's when the companies get more successful, that they can get bought. And then so I see the end of that journey. And through all of this is the lens through which I'm going to talk about what I intend to talk. Hundreds of millions have flown into this whole idea around teaching machines how to smell. And there are a lot of different applications. And the usual pitch you hear from these founders, and I've brought that pitch out too, is we taught machines how to hear. We taught them how to see. We taught them how to feel. We taught them a lot of different senses. But the one frontier that is obviously the next one that we obviously have to go for is the sense of smell. Those of you who want to found a company at some point, it's always good to have a puppy somewhere in the pitch deck, kind of helps. So here it is. And the backstory for the human diagnostic bit is that with each exhalation, we have more than 1,000 unique molecules. So you exhale millions, right, or more, but there are 1,000 unique different ones. And they vary depending on what you're doing, what disease you have, what you've been eating, and so on. So in a way, it's a data source or a looking glass into what's going on into your body. This has been researched for decades. There are renowned companies offering research services, diagnostics, and so on. But what nobody really has managed to do so far is to get that analytical product, software, tool, whatever you want to have, out of like sophisticated labs and onto the desk of a doctor. And the problem is, if it's not on the desk of the doctor, you have to sample breath and ship that to somewhere else. And so you have to have a balloon or a receptacle. You're looking at molecules that are 10 particles out of a billion. And it's not like you have diabetes, your blood sugar is high. So you have one analyte more or less associated with one disease. Of course, it's more complicated, but in the breath, usually you have to do a breath print. So you have to look at 7, 8, 10, 12 different molecules and assess them together to really get a diagnostic insight that kind of matters. And how many you have to take depends on the disease you're looking for. So it's complex. We'll get back to that in a moment. But what's kind of surprising, and some of the leading lung function test manufacturers are my clients, but they only look at the physics of your breath. If you go to the lung doctor and you do that kind of exercise, all they look at is how much air did you exhale, how fast, maybe what's the temperature of it, and that's pretty much about it. And you can get some interesting diagnostic insight from it, but it's wasted. There are like more than 1,000 data points in that breath. Why not look at the chemistry? So this is a real techie. You know, I feel a bit like a transplant here. It takes some time to get used to. Usually medical conferences are completely different. It's 70% women, completely different outfits and so on. Anyway, so this is the gentleman who came up with an interesting technology to sequence your breath. And it's what he's holding in his hand, what I'm also holding. And there's also a hint with the computer that we'll get to in a moment, which is why I'm here. That's one of the prototypes. He's been working on the earlier ones, and that's what it looks like when you look through the tube. Basically, it's a gold-plated tube with a tunable diode laser absorption spectroscopy laser on one side, and then a sensor on the other side. The thing gets reflected so that it sort of has hundreds of reflections, 20 meters measurement length, and then it is perpendicular to your breath. So the first thing it does is, like, it measures the classical spirometry stuff that I showed earlier, the physics, and then the laser basically slices through your breath. It's kind of like Mission Impossible when they try to break into a bank or something like that. And so we make sure that the molecules basically can't really escape that laser. The laser gets absorbed. There's a specific spectrum, kind of like a fingerprint, and then you can say, okay, there was this molecule in this concentration. Much more complicated than what I just said, but again, we're not diving too deep in the hardware. It's a cool technology. It has a couple of problems. It's really expensive, so you can only use it the capex. So buying it is expensive. Using it is not. So you can use it in scenarios where there's a lot of patient flow, if you will, right? So it's something where you would really screen people one after the next. And that's one hint that I'll also come back to later, right? So you really have to figure out which technology is better for which use case. The second issue that it has is it's super specific, and it's really hard for it to be distracted by other molecules. At the same time, you kind of really have to decide what molecules you want to measure and then build the thing accordingly. So it lacks flexibility, but in return, you get more specificity. There are so many other technologies. There's mass spectrometry, these big lab machines have their pros and cons. Others play with like electrochemistry, so kind of like a key and a lock, and the molecule hits that liquid, whatever you have, that creates an electric current, and you can measure that. And people go so far as to say even the ways of the current develops, if you have enough pattern recognition of ground truth data, you can distill additional insights from it using machine learning and so on. So it's getting pretty fancy on all these fronts. But again, I'm not here to sell in individual technology or something like that. The idea is that if you had that, it would make it very intuitive. People just blow into it. You kind of can get a result pretty fast within a minute, 2 or 3. Can make a real difference in many cases. If you have to wait for your blood tests, a lot can happen. You don't have to draw blood. So I was pitching this to an investor, and he almost fell asleep until he suddenly realized, oh, wait a minute, so you don't have to swab me anymore? Oh, no, I wanna know more. But he has a bit of a phobia, I think. And it can be really cost effective, right? So these lasers, the per test cost is marginal, effectively. Other devices, you may be looking at 20, 30 euro for each cartridge, which in the healthcare world, people are used to. So far, so good. But why is it not on the table? Where is it? right? What's happening? It's super complicated. So we're biological masses, right? And there's a lot of variation. So these molecules that we're looking at, they're called volatile organic compounds. You can find them in the blood, the urine, saliva, everywhere. Different ones in different concentrations and so on. And many of them get produced somewhere in your body. So maybe a cancer cell might produce something else than an infectious disease cell or whatever it is. And then it circulates into your blood. Your blood goes through your body more or less once every minute, and including through your lungs. So there's a diffusion happening, which leads to some of these molecules basically being exhaled. And then that's what you can smell. There are dogs who can smell disease, cats can do that. Some humans also, if they have hyperosmia. There's a famous case of a woman who could smell, I think it was her partner's Parkinson's disease, and so on. But there's a problem. So for example, some of these molecules are highly blood soluble, others not so much. So if they're blood soluble, it means they like to hang out in the blood. And if you stand up, the upper parts of your lung have a bit less blood than when you lie down. That's because of gravity. So it's called the ventilation perfusion coefficient. So when you lie down, suddenly the exchange surface goes bigger, which means that the molecules that are highly blood soluble also have a higher exchange surface, and then you will have more. So you take the same person, you make them stand, and then you make them lie down, and you're like, oh shit, isoprene is increasing. But in reality, it's not. It's increasing in the breath, but it's just being exchanged more. Or depending on what you eat or drink or smoke, that can also affect it. There are really popular studies. We have more than 1,000 publications on this whole topic, right? So this is not science fiction anymore, right? They're systematic reviews, it's serious stuff. But you will find studies that say, well, these are the 8 biomarkers for lung cancer. And then if you look closer, you find out, well, actually, these are the 8 markers of tissue damage caused by smoking. So you're actually measuring a confounder. And I could go on and on and on and on. Certain diseases reduce the exchange capacity of the lung, and so on and so on. There's a lot of complexity. And then again, you're looking at particle per billion. You have to look at several molecules, and the breath is quite noisy because it has turbulences, it has a high level of humidity, temperature, different breathing patterns also change how much is coming out, and I could go on. So none of this, on my view, can really work unless you have sophisticated software to accompany it, and unless you really know what you're doing on a physics level, physiology level, and so on. And that leads us to lessons learned. Any questions so far on breath test in general, or on what I just talked about, or anything you would like to dive deeper? No. So, number one, I believe that olfaction, $5 word, like most of the other advanced sensing technologies, requires a hybrid solution. So I think we're leaving the space where the low-hanging fruits are still up for grabs, where you can, I don't know, build a thermometer or something like that, and then people are happy to use it. I think the more sophisticated sensors, and that could be diagnostics for humans, it could be most other applications, they're going for more complex data, where signal-to-noise ratio management is much more relevant, where just looking at one analyte is not enough anymore, where maybe you have high time series data, so the patterns themselves really matter. And if you leave software as an afterthought, you are likely going to run into trouble, because the choice of all the sensors, the design, etc., should be done in consideration of what happens afterwards with that data. And now borrowing an example from elsewhere, I don't know how many of you are familiar with these continuous glucose measurement devices that you're putting on your. So usually how you measure blood sugar for diabetic patients is you do a finger prick, and you do that a few times throughout the day, and then you get a daily profile-ish with like very short episodic data. And if you want to get more precise, you take it out of the vein, and then there's one marker, which is the long-term marker, which is your hemoglobin, sort of subversion of it. And that gives you an idea of how was the blood sugar over the last 3 months. So it's kind of like an aggregate metric. And then suddenly people came out and said, hey, I have this idea. You have this kind of patch with a small needle in it. You put it into your onto your arm. You wear it for 2 weeks, and it will give you every few minutes a new reading on your glucose. And many of the big players that we all know had a chance to invest in that, buy it, and so on. And we're like, this is nonsense. It's not even accurate. You know, like it's never going to be as accurate as a finger prick. And it's not, and it probably never will be, but it doesn't matter because the density of information is so much more valuable. You suddenly find out how people's blood sugar is overnight. You see how it is, you know, throughout the daily activities. And you can see dynamics, like how fast is it going up and down, and that also has additional information. So we're entering an age where continuous data is becoming more interesting, getting more attention, and it's being investigated more. But then you need help to make sense of that. Doctors are not able to see through like days and days and days of blood sugar data and really make sense of it in a scalable, meaningful way. The second big thing that I keep running into, also from an investor perspective, is this just too much magical thinking around AI. There's often sort of this idea that you take some data, you put it into that magical hat, and then some amazing insight comes out of it. And it might actually even work in certain conditions, but then you unleash it onto reality and it starts to fail. And this means for me that most of the generic AI solutions, where you have maybe even the smartest statisticians and mathematicians, if they do that in isolation without really understanding the science behind it, are probably going to be bound to fail, right? There's probably something that later on turns out to be an overfitting, or I don't know what that emerges. And in this specific case, everything that I said earlier around how complicated the breath is, you know, what influences the concentrations and so on, is just one example. So you need somebody who understands the context, and typically it's not one person, right? So I've worked with a PhD in physics who's been working on sensors for a decade. I'm the medical doctor. We only work with companies that really know their stuff, and we're still seeing quite a lot of issues. So there was one company, I'll go to that in a moment, that is a world leader in what they do, and they basically gave us a bunch of data and asked us to produce something with that, and then turns out that they completely forgot most of the relevant inference factors. And so they've been in this industry for, I don't know, 60 years, but they just thought, you know, let's just put AI on it. Another aspect of that is AI is not a band-aid. So I keep seeing these things where people are like, well, the sensor is not really working so great, especially also in the breath space, you know, there's always like some issues, and then they're like, but then we put AI on it, and most people are like, yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense, right? But it's not going to fix it, and you have to understand what it is supposed to fix. At least that's sort of, I guess, what's going to be true for a while still. And so this is what I talked about, right? So many of these sensors, the most common interfering factors are, for example, temperature, moisture, humidity. It can be atmospheric pressure, and those types of things. The most common ones seem to be most commonly forgotten. I don't know why, but I keep running into projects where I'm like, so did you measure the temperature? And for example, breath biomarkers, since we're here, there are some of them, they have a condensation point at 34 degrees or 33.5. Now, the breath, as you exhale it, so body temperature is more or less 37, we all know that, but the breath is at like 34 plus minus 0.5 or 1 or something like that. So if you don't heat the thing and you want to measure that molecule that is going to condense otherwise, and you don't know what temperature it is, then the sensor is probably not even going to have a chance to actually measure it, because it's going to fall to the ground before it even hits it. And that even happens at particle per billion concentrations, right? So just in case you end up working with people, ask for the sort of the obvious stuff. The other thing I keep seeing is people selling silver bullets. So my whatever measurement platform is the best, and it's full of what the investor world likes to call turf warriors. So the guy who does the lasers feels like the only thing to do is lasers. And the guy who does electrochemistry says, well, yeah, but whatever, for this reason, this is the only thing you should be doing. And then they come up with the big visions of the future. They will probably tell you how unit economics are going to drop in the next 3 years, but hope is not a strategy. And you really have to understand, it always goes back to the same truth that we all know, but we keep forgetting, is you have to start with the problem you're trying to solve, and you have to get really specific about that. And then from there, you can think about which of the solutions, the technological solutions that are available, with their pros and cons, fit best to this specific situation, and then you're getting somewhere. But somebody who's like, oh, I've got this platform, I'm going to do everything, it's probably a red flag. Another one, regulatory compliance. And I mean that for the medical world, you have the medical device regulation, which often is called a nightmare. And I had people quit their job, a really well-paid job. They quit because they had to deal with this. They took it for 3 months and were like, sorry, I want to have a life, and this is not fun anymore. And then you have, of course, also data protection. So smell seems innocent, but you can't imagine how often people get afraid that smell could be used to identify people, to detect diseases when they don't want it to be detected. The potential for abuse, it's a powerful sense. Like we don't imagine that, right? So if you think about our language to describe colors, to describe even taste, or to describe sounds, is much more elaborate, at least in sort of our cultural circles, than the smell. If you go to more hunter-gatherer societies, I've heard the vocabulary for smell is much, much richer. And so I think our vision of smell is fairly limited. If you watch a dog run around, my mother calls it reading the dog newspaper, when they sort of sniff and try to see what happened, you can imagine that they're seeing a very different world from ours, and it's just beyond what we can expect. So I'm saying that because it's scary, and there are a lot of potentials, and the regulators will come and look at you. And so retrofitting any quality management system for this and getting the data protection right is something that, unfortunately, you have to start very early, even if it's painful. The good news is if you start early, you can do it organically and really tailor it around your needs, and then it becomes more actually useful and pragmatic if you do it well. And another aspect of that is I keep seeing founders then who feel like, oh, now I'm doing something in, I don't know, Europe. Oh, there's another opportunity in the UK. Oh, God, let's do it. It's great. And we quickly need to go to the US. And it first sounds great because you feel like you're getting a lot of markets. But with each of these, you're really increasing the regulatory complexity that you have to handle. And it's not just the fact that there are so many rules. The rate of change is what's really the worrying part, right? So constantly new regulations. It's the AI Act and all the other things, like the AI regulations. It feels like an exponential curve if you look at the statistics on how many come out these days. And so you keep having to keep abreast of those. Okay, so a bit philosophical. If you ask psychologists, they will tell you that, and it's of course being debated, but that we only perceive around 2% of reality. I don't know what that means, but you can look at, for example, the spectrum of electromagnetic spectrum and how much of that we actually see. I think it's 0.0 something percent of the whole electromagnetic spectrum is what we can see with our eyes. We don't have a magnetic sense. Machines can hear farther than us. They can hear things that are not quite as loud. They can hear differentiate at very loud noises and find signals within that where we would just shut down our ears and so on. So they are already exceeding us. And now imagine that on top, they can also smell like a dog or something like that. And it's going to just completely outperform us beyond anything that we can fathom. And even if we don't go that far, there's a big issue that most of the regulators and also the doctors these days have with any black box AI solutions. And it's not that they always want to have everything explained and understand and be able to scrutinize, but in the cases of doubt, they want to be able to look deeper. And in order to form trust, they want to sporadically be able to interrogate the devices to understand, okay, why do you think that this person has cancer? Because to me, it looks more like, I don't know, tuberculosis. And I want to understand that now so that I can make the right decision. So explainability, and it's also in the AI Act as a requirement, is something that is becoming more and more important. Now, nobody can really explain to you what explainability means. Like even humans can't really explain their decisions, so why are we expecting machines to do that? It feels a bit difficult. And there are different ways. So it goes back to, at least if you can explain the science beforehand, if you have a clear understanding, these are the markers I chose because I know the pathways of how this specific volatile organic compound is being produced in the body. And I've chosen these 8 markers to be very specific because these studies say that it is associated with this specific disease, then you're already going a long way towards what could be explainability, right? And then, of course, you have these visualizations, Sankey diagrams, and so on to show a strength of association. You could let people take out one marker and then let the machine predict it again so that you can see which thing contributes to it and so on. And I'm sure, as you know much better than me, so there's this Kolmogorov-Anton network that has been resurfaced recently, where you can basically get a formula out of predictions, and that allows people to scrutinize it more. So a lot is happening there, and that's great. But it feels to me that many of the regulators don't really know what they're talking about when they're demanding this. So it's a challenge, right? You could have the best explainability. It doesn't guarantee that you're coming through. And in the end of the day, when I talk to these XAI experts, I often feel like they are in their little mathematical world. And some of them confirm that, actually, where, I don't know, they're trying to apply game theory examples to explain why the image thinks that this is a cookie and not a dog or something like that. But then the problem is, how explainable, well, how understandable is it for a human being? And I think we should talk less about explainability and more about understandability. And then suddenly you're in a completely different terrain. You're not in the world of statistics and game theory and math and I don't know what anymore, or science. You're going heavily, well, you're still in there, right? But you're also including the world of user experience, psychology, human-computer interaction. And my view is that these aspects will grow immensely if we want to be able to translate senses like smell or other analytics that go far beyond our own imagination. We kind of have to figure out, okay, how do we make that understandable to somebody who doesn't have the same sensing capabilities? And then also the question is, what really needs to be explained and so on. So I think expect a lot of debate, which will include also, I don't know, probably philosophical and psychological disciplines. The next aspect is, and it goes a little bit back to the silver bullet thing. So often when you get pitched by, for example, diagnostics founders, they kind of position their tool as the #1 silver bullet, and after this disease X is transformed. And I get that because they want to fundraise, so they need to make it sound really impressive. As a doctor, we love to multiplex. So for us, a diagnostic process is more like you're in a dark room, and then you have a couple of people with a flashlight, and they all turn it on, and you can see different parts of the room, and then suddenly you get an idea of what room you're in and what's happening in there. But you don't expect that you have visibility into the full room, right? You just especially need to try and see the things that are most relevant. And also with every diagnostic, you also have false positive and false negatives. So if you're able to take things from a different angle where the errors don't correlate, you can reduce the diagnostic error. You can get faster and maybe better to the right test. And then also, it's important to think about what is the right step of doing things. You know, there's you usually start from the things that are least invasive, or least ionizing, or least just harmful in general, least inconvenient, like a breath test. You start with the things that are potentially cheap, and then there are many other things to consider, depending on what disease and so on. And then you take it to the next thing in order to minimize harm, be cost effective. Sometimes you have to do many things at the same time, different situation, but it's sort of a kind of a case-by-case decision. The point being, you have to think multimodal, right? We need different angles to look at something, and we need to get really intelligent about what to do at what time. And also here, the pure hardware approach will not work because it's getting increasingly complicated to multiplex all of these data points and to provide decision support on what's the next best step in the management of this patient. That all sounds super complex. At the same time, always, I think it's best to try with the things that are potentially the most boring, the most obvious use cases, the least regulated, and the ones where you're solving a real pain and not, you want to be more a painkiller rather than a vitamin pill. And you also want to find something where the monetization is clear. So you see a lot of pitches where people are like, oh, we can create so much value, sleep, so many people don't sleep well, that costs society billions. But how do you capture the part of the value that you create if you manage that society loses less money because people sleep better? So who's paying then is the other question. And so I'm seeing that a lot in breath, which goes back to people get excited, or in olfaction, right? They get excited about this idea that machines can smell. And then they try to find a lot of potential use cases which are charming, but then they can die in vain because also, until you get that product to the market, it's going to take years, usually. And investors like to call that risk stacking. So if you have an R&D risk to first prove that the thing works, and then after that, you have potentially a regulatory risk to get it through, and then comes the adoption risk that people want to use it. Doctors don't know these biomarkers. They have no clue what isoprene is. Very few do. They're used to the things. And then even if they knew, they have to wait, legally speaking, until it's in the guidelines, because if they deviate from the guideline treatment and something goes wrong, they have to justify it, which you can do. That's why you're a doctor. That's why you studied this, why you have a license. But you can only do it so often, right? So if it's something that you do all the time, it better be mandated in guidelines with very clear action points. So that also takes time. And then you need reimbursement. So people might be saying, it's so cool that you can smell cancer. I'm really impressed. However, at the moment, we're only paying for the CT scan to look at your lung. And it's a different modality because it also tells us where the cancer is and if there's a metastasis or not, and so on and so on. You can't do that. So prove to me that you're actually improving patient outcomes. And unless you haven't done that, meaning people get detected earlier so they don't get metastases, and then you can treat them and they're cured, or whatever, you have to come up with a real outcome. And most diagnostic tests don't have evidence of real outcomes. And if you don't have that, then you might have a reimbursement risk. So from an investor perspective, that's called risk stacking, because you're putting them one after the other, and then they don't add up, they kind of multiply and make you uninvestable. So what you have to do is you have to figure out something, a creative commercialization strategy, something potentially boring, obvious, and easy to monetize that you can maybe even do before you get through that regulatory pathway, for example, for a diagnostic process. So going into an industrial use case is a common thing to do, and focusing on something, even if it's a niche, but something that allows you to get real customer interactions, which not only give you money, but also important learnings. And then the other thing is, I'm getting more and more alarmed when people use a lot of metaphors, right? It's this, oh, dogs can smell, oh, dogs don't scale, so we will disrupt the dogs, and stuff like that. It's charming, it's cool, you get the image, but then people have to be able to go into the details. Okay, what are we exactly talking about here? What are the molecules you're measuring? What's the outcome you're trying to achieve with it? And if we can get to that level, then it's nice to have that metaphor, but often people stay at that superficial level. And the same with AI. I'm sure you've seen this a lot in your fields of work. Yeah, 2 bonus points, then I'll shut up, then we can do a Q&A. Or an A and Q, I don't know the way you want to play it. The one other fun fact is, I had a friend who built a diagnostic device with kind of like an electrochemical solution, whatever. And it worked great until some batches didn't. And then it worked great again, and then some didn't. And they just couldn't figure it out. They turned everything upside down. And then going back to the common interference factors are commonly forgotten. somebody said, hey, let's look at the weather data. And they found out that in the facility, when there was a certain humidity and atmospheric pressure, the batches were broken, and nobody could really explain it, but the association was significant. And so then they adjusted everything to it. So always also look at that, because otherwise you might break your heads over something that's not working, and you're just assuming that every device is exactly functioning the same way. And especially if you're looking at particle per billion concentrations, like in the breath, all of these things also really matter. Another thing that sort of I was really afraid of, there are these gurus, 30 years of breath research, Johns Hopkins, whatever, massively published and advising all of the big companies in the field and so on. I was like, fuck it, I'm just gonna reach out, see what he says. And he was so nice and so supportive, and everybody is. And they're like, call anytime, I don't want anything, I just want to see this proceed. So, and he saved me probably in 30 minutes, literally a year and a half of running into the right direction. And maybe that's also a theme for today. So many people with so much experience. There's no harm in asking or sharing. In the end of the day, society will benefit from it. And there's enough for all of us to grab, so why not be generous with insights and knowledge? Thank you very much. Any cues? Yes.
How far have your device?
Yeah. So it's ongoing. Probably, I would say, still 2 to 3 years ahead in terms of research. We partnered with a US-based company that are also taking a different approach. So we're having 2 technological bets. They just finished a study with 70 patients. And a lot of learnings, a lot of sort of interesting aspects. There were some biomarkers that we ended up throwing away that looked great in the beginning, and then in parallel, somebody else publishes that marker doesn't make sense. Like, great. But frankly, I think it still is, with some exceptions, a technology that still is a couple of years out. I truly believe that the world needs these things. I think that we will see it. The jury honestly is out on which technology is going to make the race and how these things are going. I think there will be quite a lot of bankruptcies in the field also, with some really prominent cases. But it just adds to the knowledge. So I think honestly, people that have been in this field for a long time, many of them gave up, and now when they see what is happening on the AI front, they are saying, okay, I think now it's really worth giving this a lot of attention again. And I assume this is true for many other diagnostic areas as well. Love the question. Has anybody worked in breath? I'm amazed that we have so many people interested in this.
We had a customer who wanted to invent with ultrasound.
Mm-hmm.
One of those interferences. What happened to us was that in the room the air was perfectly still.
Oh yeah.
But that's not good. It seems like there are small air bubbles, like just sitting there, and sometimes we needed to add a little fan, just a little light breeze, and now it sensor works perfectly and predictably.
Yeah.
That was just so weird.
So that's a really good point. So the thing is, you never stop learning, right? In the medical world, there's this thing called post-market surveillance, where once you have the product out, you're expected to constantly monitor any publication that comes out, talk to the users. We are building a tool to automatically collect data from the usage of the device and so on. And then you have to have these constant feedback loops to figure exactly these things out. There's so many things, it's just impossible to come up with that or many other things. And that's okay, right? At some point, it's important to launch. You have to make sure that there's no really grave risk, and you have to make sure that you're able to respond fast. And then again, if you have the right software to do recall management, to reach out to the users where they are, it becomes a different game. But you still have so many diagnostic companies. They build a hardware thing, they send it to a wholesaler, that person sends it then to the doctor somewhere, and then if there's a problem, they have these books, or maybe now it's an Excel, I don't know what they use, and then they're like, oh, this serial number went to this guy, and let's contact them, and so on. And it's just too slow, right? So we have to get much better to keep learning. Yeah.
same case, why we could argue that AI is different from those cases.
You mean the explainability is what you challenge? Okay, so the question was, if it works and if it helps, why do you need to question it, right? More or less. And for humans, we're fine if it works, even if we couldn't fully explain. And that's correct. So in medicine, we don't like, I don't know, ambitious, ambivalent feeling. There's this term of scientific debt. So we have pills that we prescribe to you. We know they kind of work in most cases. We actually don't always know exactly why. We have some ideas, but if you ask too many questions, we will be like, well, that we don't really know. And we still do it. It would be unethical to withhold these things simply because we already know how well they work, and that has evidence, right? So we have evidence of the fact that it works. We don't exactly know sometimes why it doesn't work, and so on. So why would we treat AI differently is a fair question. And the point is that we need to figure out why in certain cases something does not work. So you might have, for example, a data set that has, I'm going to take a stereotype now, right? Data set that only has been trained on white Northern Europeans, and then you have an Asian person with potentially a different microbiome, potentially different genetics, potentially different nutrition habits, and the thing would maybe constantly underdiagnose something really important. And there's an abundance of these issues. A lot of studies have excluded Black people in the US, and you can see that their health outcomes are worse. Some studies are more done on women, and other studies are less done on women. So the applicability, the external validity of that study is not always given. So we need to understand where does something not work. And you might have edge cases. You might have this one patient where it's very clear this is a lung infection. Now we're going to go to get an antibiotic. We come back 3 days later, we measure, and the infection markers did not go down. And the person is not better. And you're like, okay, everything looked obvious. What did we miss? And in order to figure that out, you need to be able to interrogate your data, go back to the patient and so on. And if the AI can help you by saying, well, I thought it was just an infection because I saw this and this and this. And then you see, oh, yeah, but it didn't know that the person also has sort of this other medication. And that leads you faster to the response. And I think that's part of the answer. And the other part is no diagnostic has 100% sensitivity or specificity. You will always have a negative test in somebody who's actually positive and a positive test in somebody who's negative. And you have to hunt for these. You have to find them as fast as possible. So yeah, I guess with great power comes great responsibility. So since these things are more powerful, the expectation is also higher. But another great question, thanks. Yes? Fantastic. Yeah. I fully agree. Hypothesis generation. So the question is cost of failure, right? So if we try to wait for the perfect thing, if I'm getting you right, we miss out on a lot of opportunities, right? And one would be the generation of new hypotheses that we can then test later, for example, in studies or by doing a treatment test on a person to see if that works. And I agree with you. I think most doctors would agree with you. That would be fine. But the ambition would be that we get there at some point. And unfortunately, I feel like the European regulations see it a little bit differently. So they often are really bad at seeing the counterfactuals. We have a new medical device regulation for a couple of years now because they wanted to make sure that the devices are safer, but we only have 40 deaths per year on faulty medical devices. The opportunity of saving lives, if we allow more innovation, is probably in the millions. And they don't do that. They don't do their own risk management, which has been heavily criticized by the community. They're trying to roll back on it, but it's the European Union, so it's gonna probably take a while. There was some other show of hands? No? Well, thank you so much for listening. Have a great time.